Kink visibility is a reminder that any person can and should shamelessly explore what brings joy and excitement. I mean, they're literally talking about children watching kink parades. I'm pretty sure that the line from there to pedophilia is real thin. Well, today marks the first day of non-Pride Month, which means that all of the corporate logos go back to normal. All the corporations stop with their woke virtue signaling, and they're not expected to keep up with the woke virtue signaling. So, I guess that Pride is over and we're back to regular life is the way that this nonsense works. But not before. The worst column of Pride Month came out in the Washington Post. It's by a person named Lauren Roello, a writer who lives in the Philadelphia area. Okay, so this person wrote a piece in the Washington Post titled, "Yes, Kink belongs at Pride, and I want my kids to see it." Now, I tend to be pretty libertarian about things, right? When I don't think the government should really be in the business of compulsion unless somebody is hurting somebody else. And this starts to get dicey when you're talking about children. There is a battle that is brewing about the future of our nation's kids, and it is unavoidable. It is not avoidable. There is no libertarian solution to it. Okay, the libertarian solution typically, which is let everybody do whatever it is that they want, as long as they're not hurting anybody else, that libertarian argument ceases to apply when you're talking about the impact on children who do not have the power of consent, do not have fully rational characteristics, are not capable of making decisions. Then we as a society have to decide what the rules of the road are going to be. And this has come up in the context of, for example, critical race theory recently, where the right has said, quite correctly, that children should not be indoctrinated with the nonsense of critical race theory, which suggests that racially essential characteristics determine your value and your perspective on matters of politics and whether you have a chance of success in the United States. Kids should not be indoctrinated with that. It's a violation of children's ability to thrive. And it is, in fact, a form of emotional and intellectual child abuse to teach kids that they are victimizers or the victimized. Okay, so when it comes to kids, we all do have a fairly large say in what the societal standard should be. Because again, there's a non-consenting party who's now part of this bargain. Okay, the same thing holds true when it comes to social policy. So the left has decided, and this is, again, I think an unavoidable battle that is going to come to your town. It is going to come to your state. It's going to come to your household. Okay, the unavoidable battle is you have a group of people on the left, and they suggest that if you raise your child in a traditional manner, if you raise your child to believe that a traditional family structure is better, okay, that a man and a woman raising a child is better than a man and a man or a woman and a woman. If you believe that men and women exist and that these are not malleable categories and that a man cannot become a woman and that if a child suffers from gender dysphoria, you should participate in, for example, watchful waiting, right? You should simply wait to see how things develop. You should not give in to the delusion that your child actually is a member of the opposite gender. The left believes if you do that, that's a form of child abuse and CPS should arrive at your door. Right? Don Lemon on CNN, literally yesterday, said that he believes only the state should be involved in adoption decisions, presumably because he likes the state's perspective when it comes to these matters of social politics. And he thinks that churches should be taken completely out of the business of adoption, not because he doesn't like quote-unquote churches per se, but because he doesn't like the perspective of churches, which may adopt out to traditional father-mother families and not to male-male families, female-female families, single dads or single moms. Right, so that is one perspective on the raising of children, is that the social left ought to win. And then there's the perspective from the right, which is that children's innocence when it comes to matters of sex ought to be preserved, that you are fully not only justified, but doing a good in teaching your child traditional sexual values, that teaching your child, for example, that getting married to a member of the opposite sex and producing natural-born children is more likely to produce happiness, that if you teach your kid that, you're doing something good for them, and that if you indoctrinate them into confusion, and more importantly, if you sexualize children at a very young age, you are doing grave harm not only to their psyche, but also to their emotional state. That perspective means that there will have to be some protections for children. And these two wildly varying perspectives are now coming to a head, and they're in direct conflict. And so this column from the Washington Post is indicative of that conflict, and it should awaken people who are sort of softly in the middle, the silent middle, that this battle is going to happen. And the folks who claim that they just want to live and let live perspective on how people raise their kids, they're mostly lying. It really is not true. Okay, because the way that identity works in the United States now is based on emotivism. Identity is rooted in the notion that if I deny your perspective on your own identity, then I have participated in a harm against you and I must be stopped. This is why you are seeing, for example, an attempt it will come to the United States, by the way. You've already seen it in Canada. There's an attempt now to go after parents on the basis that they are not teaching their children the state-approved messaging with regard to gender and sexual orientation. That's going to come to the United States because the perspective of the left is you are doing grave harm to a child if you don't teach their sort of polyamorous perspective on how exactly sexual matters should work. If you don't teach that to children, if you don't indoctrinate kids in that. And these two worldviews are clashing, and they're clashing when it comes to kids. Now to this column in the Washington Post, which is astonishing. Again, this is printed in a major, one of the two biggest American newspapers in terms of influence and impact. Lauren Rowello writing, quote, "Our family often took the train into Philadelphia, but as we rode across the bridge to attend the city's Pride Parade 5 years ago, my wife's leg bounced with a nervous jitter. She squeezed my hand, worried that she might run into a colleague or be harassed by a stranger. My wife is trans and wasn't out at the time, so she typically only expressed her authenticity in the privacy of our home. That morning, she wore a green skirt and light makeup, brushing her hair all to one side. Even though we'd attended pride marches and protests in previous years, that day was our first celebrating openly as a family." Okay, so what we are talking about now is a male-female couple in which the male now identifies as female. Okay, so number one, that is highly likely to confuse children. Okay, that in and of itself. Okay, but beyond that, they're now taking their kid, their small children, to a pride parade in which you are celebrating sexual activity. That's what pride is. Okay, pride is not a mere question of family structure. It is a celebration of particular types of sexual activity. Because after all, if it were just a celebration of family structure, then you could have two brothers adopting a kid, or a brother and a sister, or a single mom, right? But that's not what pride parades typically are about. As people have noted, people who have been to pride parades and who cover pride parades understand that pride parades very often, and almost entirely, the universality of pride parades include sexual components to them, right? That undoubtedly. So children should not be at these things. Adults want to participate. You can make a libertarian argument, obviously, and it's a libertarian argument with which I generally agree, which is this is not a matter of compulsion. However, if you're talking about children, now you're talking about non-consenting people being put into sexual scenarios for the pleasure of adults. That's the only reason you're bringing kids to this thing. So this is what this mother writes. "When our children grew tired of marching, we plopped onto a nearby curb. Just as we got settled, our elementary schooler pointed in the direction of oncoming floats, raising an eyebrow at a bare-chested man in dark sunglasses whose black suspenders clipped onto a leather thong. The man paused to be spanked playfully by a partner with a flog. 'What are they doing?' my curious kid asked as our toddler cheered them on. The pair was the first of a few dozen kinksters who danced down the street, laughing together as they twirled their hips and batons, some leading companions by leashes. At the time, my children were too young to understand the nuance of the situation, but I told them the truth, that these folks were members of our community celebrating who they are and what they like to do." See, the conflation of who they are and what they like to do is always a very interesting identity-driven notion, right? That who you are is what you like to do. It's the same thing. It's there's an argument to be made that is not, that immutable characteristics do not include flogging other men in public on the bare bottom. I mean, I think there's a fair notion that, for example, if you're making the argument that gay rights are similar to race rights, I'm spotting some differences there. Also, I love that she says, "My children are too young to understand the nuance of this." What's the nuance exactly? Like, really, explain to me the nuance of men walking down the street, spanking each other on the bare bottom with flogs in front of children. Is there a lot of nuance there that I'm missing? I feel like not. But according to the left, this is nuanced education of children, according to the radical left. Now, I do want to differentiate. Again, I think there's a broad middle of the country. Particularly, I know a lot of gay folks who think that this is really terrible, that you should not be exhibiting kink behavior in front of children. But the point is this. The radical left, which has basically decided that all human behavior ought to be treated the same, unless it's religious behavior, that all human sexual behavior ought to be treated with equal levels of respect and acceptability, and that children ought to be indoctrinated into that belief, it's hard to argue against that principle on the basis of a sort of lack of fundamental understanding of natural law. According to the Washington Post's columnist, the kink community has participated in Pride since its inception, risking their jobs and safety to be authentically themselves in public. See, it's all about authentically themselves. It's all about you. And we have to indoctrinate children to accept your quote-unquote authentic self and to celebrate your authentic self. So it's not about kids. It's about you. It's about you feeling good about yourself and indoctrinating kids in order to not focus on them leading a happy life, but in order to create a society in which you feel more welcomed and accepted. This is the perspective of the radical left, and they can't feel welcomed and accepted unless your children, too, participate in the celebration and the acceptance. Says this columnist in the Washington Post, I agree that Pride should be a welcoming space for children and teens, but policing how others show up doesn't protect or uplift young children. Instead, homogenizing self-expression at Pride will do more harm to our children than good. When my own children caught glimpses of kink culture, they got to see that the queer community encompasses so many more non-traditional ways of being, living, and loving. As much as I want them to spend time in queer spaces so they can be with families like their own, I also want them to know they shouldn't limit their understanding of what relationships or expressions look like to whatever's most familiar. I want them to see they can make their own way in the world. How else can they learn about the scope and vitality of queer life? How delightful. How delightful. And this columnist continues, quote, children who witness kink culture are reassured that alternative experiences of sexuality and expression are valid, no matter who they become as they mature, helping them recognize that their personal experiences aren't bad or wrong, and they aren't alone in their experiences. I can't think of a more relevant or important reminder for youth, who often struggle with feelings of isolation and confusion as they discover more about themselves and wrestle with concerns about whether they're normal enough. Including kink in Pride opens space for families to have necessary and powerful conversations with young people about health, safety, consent, and, most uniquely, pleasure. Kink visibility is a reminder that any person can and should shamelessly explore what brings joy and excitement. See, this is the problem with the radical left's argument. There are a lot of things that we don't approve of as a society that I'm sure bring a certain subset of the population joy and excitement, and they are forbidden by law, and well, they should be. By the way, sexualizing children removes one of those barriers. But understand, the case that this person is making is not only that we shouldn't ban kink at Pride parades, it's that it is a fundamental good for children to watch kink at Pride parades. It makes them more open-minded. It makes them more accepting. And of course, we're really protecting them because you never know what weird stuff they might be into. And if those kids who are 5, 6, 4 years old, if they turn out to be into weird stuff, which of course would never be shaped by the environment in which they're raised, of course. I mean, environment has nothing to do with this. It's completely genetic. Kink is just completely genetic, just like everything else, except for the fact that it's not, and there's no proof of that. But it's completely, so you don't have to worry about your kids being affected because, they're just going to be who they're going to be sexually, of course. Okay, all of this is designed at the indoctrination of children. Okay, it's designed at the indoctrination of children and pushing what are behaviorally abnormal standards on children, and then teaching those children that the highest form of good is celebration of this. It is sexualizing children. And by the way, you making like the line from here to pedophilia is pretty straight. I mean, it's a pretty straight line from it is good for kids to watch kink so that they can explore their own sexual feelings to why can't they consent in actually exploring their sexual feelings with people? I mean, why? I mean, children are sexual beings too. If you can't see the line being blurred here, they're literally talking about children watching kink parades. I'm pretty sure that the line from there to pedophilia is real thin. Says this columnist, we don't talk to our children enough about pursuing sex to fulfill carnal needs that delight and captivate us in the moment. Is that really what we don't talk to our children enough about? Really, that's what society is lacking, is it? Is the pure pursuit of carnal pleasure and speaking about it to small children who are incapable either of understanding it because they haven't even hit puberty yet, or two, even if they're teenagers, making solid decisions on that basis. They remove all moral lines and they're going to live a happier life, seems to be the predominant notion. And again, what that really is about is people adults want to express their authentic selves, and they want children to applaud them because they want everybody to applaud them. That is not good. Okay, I never want my children to worry that exploring any aspect of consensual sex or touch is taboo. Again, I'm going to read that sentence slowly for you because I don't understand how this doesn't blur over into pedophilia. Seriously. I never want my children to worry that exploring any aspect of consensual sex or touch is too taboo. If you have kids, you're going to teach them a lot about what kind of touch is okay and what kind of touch is not. But says this columnist, if we're afraid to talk about kink with our children, we prioritize the status quo. And here's the big issue, right? Sanitizing and censoring their access to information about appropriate and normal self-expression. You're damaging the children. Remember, this is not just, I want to raise my child how I want to raise my child, which again, would be objectionable because your child can't consent to how you're raising them in a perverse way. Beyond that, I mean, honestly, in a decent society, CPS would be on its way after reading this column. Child Protective Services would be headed directly to this person's house after reading this column, exposing children to men flogging each other's bare bottoms in public. My goodness. Okay, but that's not the extent of this. The extent is your child should be exposed to this too. It's that your child is less, and you're a worse parent for not exposing your kids to this. These are the very attitudes that made Pride necessary and life-affirming for so many of us in the first place. We have no business imposing them on the next generation. Kink embodies the freedom Pride stands for, reminding attendees to unapologetically take up space as an act of resistance and celebration, refusing to bend to social pressure that asks us to be presentable. That's a value I want my children to learn. Whew. Okay, well, this is child abuse. And the fact that we as a society have decided that this stuff is worthy of the pages of the Washington Post says an awful lot about the direction of our society, because everything that people think is too radical and far-fetched 5 years from now becomes the law of the land. That seems to be the common pattern when it comes to social politics and sexual politics in the nation. And once again, we are going to reach a point where Americans just say no, and they should have said no to a lot of this stuff. Once it's reached the pages of the Washington Post, it is, my goodness. But the blowback is coming, and it's coming strong. And the more the left embraces this stuff, do it. Like, really. I'd love to see it. I think the apathetic middle is not going to remain apathetic for long when you start telling them that their children need to watch kink parades in order to be more broad-minded so that they will not be judged, because we don't want them to be judgmental of others, and also because they, the children, need to explore their own kink sides. And the reason I'm spending a lot of time on this is because it is indicative of a consistent worldview. There's a worldview on the left that says all sexual behavior is appropriate and decent and good. And also that children should be taught it. Okay, and again, if you think all sexual behavior is appropriate and decent and good, then why shouldn't children be taught it, after all? In fact, the worst thing you could do is repress children in a Freudian sense. This is the moral battle in which parents are now engaged. And you wonder why people are moving from blue states to red states. You wonder why people are seeking to protect their children by taking them out of public schools and not subjecting them to the scrutiny of state authorities, or more and more thinking like this parent is thinking. And there's a phrase that my friend Eric Erickson has used in the past. He says, whatever is allowed eventually becomes compulsory, right? You will be forced to care. Whatever is allowed becomes compulsory in the end. And that is exactly right when it comes to the social left and its politics. You think right now this woman is just saying, I want to take my kid to a kink parade, which is bad enough. Eventually you must take your kid to a kink parade. Because if you don't take your kid to a kink parade, you are performing an act of child abuse and you are undermining social norms that accept kink behavior. That is the way it's going to go. Okay, and kink is just an outer edge example of how this has been a mainstream philosophy on the left for a very long time, which is we need to indoctrinate your kids in K through 12 about the wonders of LGBTQ lifestyles and LGBTQ morality and the falsity of gender ideology, and we must indoctrinate them now. We have to do the same thing on race. The left is not willing to allow you to live and let live. That middle libertarian perspective, it just doesn't exist when it comes to the education of children. The left knows it. The right better get onto this real fast. I think they're starting to. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.